Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. He writes for the Daily Norseman, along with many other blogs around the internet. And his name is Arif Hassan. Arif, how you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. I just watched another Philip Rivers performance for the ages. We were talking about this just briefly pre-show. It turns out that the Chargers are just the Monday night team. It seems like they play at least 2 or 3 Monday night games every year, and most of them seem to end with some fluky play, meaning the Chargers lose their lead in the fourth, and Philip Rivers has to do Philip Rivers things and march them down the field, and more often than not, it just ends in a loss. And it ends with a couple of beautiful pictures and GIFs at the end of the game where they're just zoomed in on Philip Rivers' face. This one being no exception. And I was watching it with a girlfriend and just going, oh, I've seen this one. I know how this one ends. I know I like the new stuff the NFL puts out, but sometimes you just want the hits. This is just a beautiful rerun. They just seem to keep airing every Monday night or so.
Well, I just checked the Chargers, so they average, it looks like, just a little under 2 a year since 2009. So they had 2 in 2009, 2 in 2010, 2 in 2011, 2 in 2012, 2 in 2013, 1 in 2014, and of course they just had one against Chicago after having one earlier in the year against Pittsburgh. So in every year since 2009, except for one, they've had 2. Which is kind of annoying because, they're not... It's been a while since they were the team that got to the AFC Championship game and got bounced by... the Patriots?
I want to say the Patriots have been bouncing them for years. Or had they had a nice stretch when LaDainian Tomlinson was their back, when they just kept bouncing him and bouncing him. But yeah, it's just wow, it's the same way the Cowboys or the Broncos seem to be the Sunday night game every single week. It's okay, well, this is especially this year, where the Cowboys are just awful. You're just, oh, God, please. Oh, look, it's going into overtime, so I have to keep watching, right? This is just how this is all going to end.
Yeah. We're required to watch games that go into overtime, no matter how bad they be.
It's just not. It's not fair. Why, NFL? Why are you forcing? Ugh. Okay. So now that we got that direct out of the way, welcome to the show. We have lots to talk about. We have plenty of hot takes and plenty of interesting discussion to hit. Before we start the show, we'd just like to thank our listeners for supporting us through the football season. Really do appreciate it. We have had quite a bit of donations from you guys. If you've listened to the show, you know that this is not something that this is not a show where we take money from other sponsors or something. We just go straight to the listeners. We thank you for keeping the lights on. We thank you that we don't have to sit here and talk about underwear or talk about stamps or anything. This is straight from you guys. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we can skip all the ads and talk about the number one thing on everyone's mind after watching the game which we won against the Rams. The thing everyone's talking about is the dirty hit on Bridgewater that knocked him out on the field. I guess the first question is to you: dirty or not dirty?
I mean, obviously, it's impossible to sell with 100% certainty. But it definitely seems and feels like a dirty hit. So there's a couple of things I want to mention. The first is that you have to be careful when you use freeze frames, and you have to be careful when you do slow motion replay to take a look at these things. I mean, because there's a lot of stuff out there that says we are more likely to assign intentionality to an event that we see in slow-mo because we overestimate the ability of people to react. And I was having a debate about reaction times on Twitter with someone But I still think it's, largely dirty. I mean, it is true that he lowers his hips and launches after Teddy starts his slide, and it's also true that he does not lead with the shoulder or the helmet. But I think that using your forearm or using your elbow against a helmet, that is not easy. Like I don't know where he intends to hit Bridgewater if there's not a slide. But Bridgewater's slide is well started by the time he leaves the ground, and it's definitely possible to, leap over a sliding quarterback with the amount of time that he had. And it's like again, not 100% certainty, and it's difficult to tell what information he had at the time. But he says, and a couple of his defenders are saying that he was trying to roll away, and it does look like he's like moving and pivoting in a certain way. But also, it doesn't look like he didn't. There were ways I think he could have avoided the hit that he didn't choose. That I think that he had a reasonable amount of time to do so. And athlete reaction times are really quick.
It looked like he was launching. Like that's what it ends up showing, or that's what it appears to show anyway. Is that when he started to go down, was like visibly sliding. He had he had a couple of yards there. He could have moved out of the way. He could have leapt over. Instead, he chose to deliver a flying elbow drop from the top rope and knock him out.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that what accelerates this, and it's not stuff that holds up in a court of law, but I think in terms of like reasonable people's agreeing, which by the way is like the way the NFL does it, like more likely than not as the standard. You take into account the previous hit on Bridgewater, which was at the knees. You take into account the history of their defensive coordinator. And I think that there's a lot of obviously circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of evidence that I think points to this being an intentional play. I mean, it's super frustrating, and it's upsetting to see. But I think it's a dirty hit. I listened to the arguments that it was not a dirty hit. I think there are reasonable people that believe it's not a dirty hit. And I don't think those arguments are very compelling to me.
No, I would definitely end up agreeing with that. I was listening to the press conferences that were coming out and the discussion even today. We're taping this on Monday night, so this will be released on Tuesday morning. We were listening to some of the stuff that was coming out. Obviously, Mike Zimmer was very upset. Totally right to be. I was almost of the belief that they weren't going to throw the flag on the hit until the ref saw, oh hey, Bridgewater's eyes are closed and he's lying in the middle of the field. Like it really did seem like there was an excessive amount of time between when they were going to throw it and when they actually did. But man, a lot has been made about Bountygate too, and I'm referring to it as Bountygate too because this is just how it's exploded on Twitter and in the blogs. I don't necessarily, I don't want to think that there is some sort of culture of this, but man, is that suspect. And Mike Zimmer would probably know about it, considering he's good friends with Sean Payton, who claimed to not know a damn thing about Bountygate, the first one. And didn't his son coach for the Saints during that season?
I think so. Now that you mention it, I'm taking a look. Do you mean Adam Zimmer? Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'll take a look at what season that he that he coached. Oh my God, his Vikings.com biography has like nothing on it, which of course he doesn't.
But it just, man, that every Vikings fan looked at that hit and just wanted something terrible to be done to the Rams. Like, no one wanted to see players injured, but we wanted to see the defense fired up, and we wanted to see like we wanted to see people down and just like hit hard. Like, especially after the play that did not get a call, which we will talk about in more detail, but the shot to the legs, which some Rams fans had declared that he was Bridgewater is just Bridgewater's just acting there. He didn't actually get hit. No, he went down. He clearly went down. But there was no flag. And that was what it looked. The count of the steps was either 3 or 4 steps, and then the hit.
I think so. The weird thing about that is that the refs didn't flag it because he was out of the pocket, and one aspect of this is like sort of true, which is that you can't get flagged for the normal things that protect a quarterback below the waist when you're outside of the pocket. But there's two things I want to add to that. First, like you said, it's a late hit, which those are flagged inside and outside of the pocket. But the second thing is, and this is a letter versus a spirit of the law kind of thing. The exception was carved into the rule to allow defensive players to hit quarterbacks who are declared runners. And obviously, if they really, really wanted to, they could have actually written, a declared runner or whatever in the rules. But those are a little bit harder to enforce, and those are always controversial. So inside, outside the pocket is a cleaner distinction. But they were actually designed to allow defenders to take shots at running quarterbacks or quarterbacks, who are threats to run. And on that play, obviously, Bridgewater wasn't because he was backpedaling pretty far downfield. Actually, it was
back into
worrisome.
the left. Yeah, back into the left, away from where the ball was going.
Yeah,
not in danger of running at all or getting like a lateral or something. No, he was fine hanging out back there. Just.
Yeah. Also, I looked it up. Adam Zimmer was a defensive backs coach, assistant defensive backs coach in the Saints 2009, which of course adds like a super interesting addition to Mike Zimmer talking about Gregg Williams' history. Yeah. In fact, Adam Zimmer, there's an article at Scott.com. It's a pay article, but I'll link it in the show notes anyway. But in that article, he praises the ability to have worked under Gregg Williams and Romeo Crennel. That's a little weird. But it sounds like Mike Zimmer believes what he believes even after having talked to Adam. And I think that's like pretty good evidence that Mike Zimmer is like pretty confident of what happened.
Yeah, if anybody is going to be able to throw accusations about that, I want to say it would be Mike Zimmer because of the relation to everybody involved. But man, that I was worried for a second the refs weren't going to be able to get out of there alive. Like if they hadn't have thrown a flag on the Bridgewater hit that actually knocked him out, man, I really don't know. There were so many questionable ref calls that whole game. Just what a weird setup.
Yeah, that was messed up.
Yeah.
And also like consider that the Rams were extraordinarily heavily penalized throughout the game, which I think is another indicator of dirty play. And in fairness, some of those penalties are offsides calls, and there were a couple of those. At least one was like a holding call that's not like a dirty style of play. But I think it speaks to the kind of things that the coaching staff prioritizes in terms of playing disciplined versus undisciplined football. We saw the number of Lions penalties go down when Jim Schwartz left. We saw the number of Oakland penalties go down when Hugh Jackson left. I think that that's a reflection on the coaching staff in a lot of ways. And even if it's not about dirty play, which I think in this case it kind of is, especially because there's been accusations throughout the years of Gregg Williams teams and Jeff Fisher teams of being accused of being dirty teams. Brandon Fusco said that, which makes me think that there's like stuff happening on the line of scrimmage that's dirty, that's not called. Those accusations are going for years. I just think that even if it's not intentional, and I think it is, I think that there's something about the culture of the coaching staff that doesn't prioritize like doing things like avoiding penalties and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's entirely possible, and it would definitely make a lot of sense considering. I was joking that there were so many Rams penalties as far as like offsides that that they were throwing off the Vikings, and that's why the Vikings kept getting penalties. Because we're not a penalized team. We're going into this game anyway. We're one of the lowest penalized teams in the entire league. And
I think actually the Vikings were so lowly penalized that after the game they were still the least penalized team in the league. I'd have to look that up, but I think that's true.
Yeah, just what a if you were a big fan of flying yellow things, flying yellow pieces of plastic or paper, man, this was the game for you, because there was just nothing but flags for like the third quarter. It was just ridiculous. But let's talk about the plays between the penalty flags, and let's talk about our offense to start us off. We started off with two pretty good drives. First one with a field goal, and then the second one ending with a touchdown. It certainly helped that we started the game on the 47-yard line, on their 47-yard line. But let's go through and talk a little bit, because the first two drives looked good, and then we got a whole bunch of nothing until the second half.
Yeah, and that's the product of a couple of things. I think that Peterson was pretty good in this game, and so you can't necessarily just say, well, the running game wasn't getting off like it was in a lot of the previous games, where the running game was a bit of a problem. But I think a lot of it has to do with pass protection. Teddy was pressured on 42% of his dropbacks in this game, so 10 of 24. And a lot of those did not happen on blitzes. So I think that plays a part of it. And again, when your quarterback is pressured on over 30% of the dropbacks, which is about median, their quality tends to drop a lot. In fact, quarterbacks under pressure tend to lose about 30 passer rating points, as it were, versus when they're not under pressure. Teddy in this game, when he was not under pressure, had a passer rating of 105.6. When he was under pressure, his passer rating was 6.3. And that's mostly because he had 3 completions on 8 attempts. 2 of those completions, I believe, were dropped, so that's not quite his fault. But the interception that he threw, and again, when you only have 8 attempts, 10 dropbacks, but 8 attempts, your passer rating tends to be skewed one way or the other. That interception happened when he was under pressure. I think that's a big part of it. Teddy himself, there were difficulties in terms of his play. We'll see when the All-22 comes out. Of course, every week I seem to say, he looked better on the All-22, but without that right now, it looked like he was playing pretty poorly. Those deep balls were an issue. Mike Wallace was an issue. Twice Mike Wallace ran routes that looked awful. Those passes looked inaccurate. But I think that when you take into account sort of, where Mike Wallace was supposed to be, I think that, you give Bridgewater a little bit of leeway. There was a dropped interception. That was entirely on Charles Johnson. He kind of stopped mid-route on a slant, and that's entirely on Charles Johnson. So, a lot of these incompletions, either the drops or, the wide receiver wasn't doing what he was supposed to. But, you can't not say, hey, Teddy Bridgewater played poorly, because he did. 2 of his incompletions were throwaways, so you can kind of, scratch those out. But I think that definitely played a role that Teddy was not. He wasn't playing as well as even he had throughout most of the year, and I say that without any sarcasm. I think that he's actually played pretty decently most of the year. But from a numbers perspective, he's playing a lot better than a lot of people think, even after you don't adjust for like pressure and drops and stuff like that. But yeah, I think the offense wasn't getting going because the passing game, whether it's the receivers, whether it's Teddy, whether it's the offensive line, probably all three, had problems. So that's a big issue with the offense. At the end of the day, they got points on the board. So.
Yeah, that is a positive, and apparently we don't have to worry about Blair Walsh anymore, or at least his field goals. So that's one less thing to worry about. So that's nice.
Yeah, it's actually kind of crazy. Blair Walsh is like the number 3 kicker according to PFF right now. If you compare that to like the first 2 weeks of the season, he was like near the bye. He was 33rd in the first 2 weeks of the season. So go Blair.
Can you get most improved player like in the season? Like you just started out crap. Last year wasn't bad, but like you just started out crap, and all of a sudden like, oh, okay, well you're the number 1 or number 2 kicker in the league. Good job.
Well, actually, if you do include last year, you could put Blair Walsh on it because, he was actually pretty bad last year. When you adjust for like 50-plus yard field goals, he wasn't as bad. But he was still pretty bad last year. In the preseason, this year, he was 61 of 67, he was 6 for 11 on field goals. So even if you just include last year in the preseason, Blair Walsh might legitimately be the most improved player in the NFL. Isn't that crazy?
I like that stat. That's that's a weird little stat, and I like it. Especially because he's doing well. AP ended up running for 125 yards, 1 touchdown. Was cutting through the Rams line like it was butter, but was dropping the balls like they were greased. Had 2 fumbles right in a row. I don't know which one you want to talk about first, but 125 yards is not bad, especially considering this defense. But 2 fumbles dropped in a row consecutively.
Yeah, there's two things actually. One is that the Vikings have been extraordinarily lucky when it comes to fumble luck. I believe they've recovered 7 of 9 or 9 of 11 or something like
Yeah,
that.
we've talked about that on the show. Like it's
Yeah.
absurd the amount of luck we've had with fumbles, especially Adrian's.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can include, Stephon Diggs, I think he had 2 fumbles in his breakout game. That's out of control. And who knows if those are luck based because he was alone on the field. But still, yeah. And hopefully the Vikings can clean up the fumble thing, especially Adrian, who in that first game I think he had 3, but 1 doesn't count because there's a penalty, and the other one he recovered. You want to clean up these sorts of things because in terms of like predicting a pattern for success, that's an issue, and it's been an issue kind of all year, kind of quietly. But in terms of his running, he was really consistent and really good, and it's been a while since I think that he's had 2 consecutive games of being consistent and good. Because obviously in the one game he played last year, he wasn't that good. That kind of doesn't count. But if you go all the way back to 2013, he had a lot of good games and he had a lot of bad games, but he definitely wasn't consistent from game to game for most of the year. So it's nice to see 2 games in a row from him. Where he's been successful on what for him are a good portion of his runs, and from in terms of like his average, because he only gained his longest gain was only 15 yards, and on that one that was like a shoelace tackle. Looked like he was going to break it out for a touchdown, which is something I think we're all pretty familiar with in the Minnesota fandom. But yeah, 125 yards, 4.3 yards per carry, very solid yards per carry. But I think that 4.3 yards per carry is much more interesting when you consider that he didn't really have a long run to skew it. But he did have a couple of short, like goal line-ish runs to skew it. So yeah, I think that for the most part, he had a pretty good game. Those fumbles kind of worry me because they've been a consistent issue. But for the most part, he had a good game, and it's the second like really good game in a row.
And he's on top of the league with rushing yards too. So that's a cool positive.
Yeah, take that, Devonta Freeman. Screw you.
1. Okay. Let's talk about the Rams defense for just a moment. The Rams ended up with 1 sack on Teddy, technically, 5 hits, and the offensive line is really starting to hold its own. This was not this is a defense without 2 of their stars, but this is not something you should discount. This was a pretty good performance by them.
Well, I think, and this relates to sort of the pressure thing from earlier. I think some of it has to actually do with Teddy getting rid of the ball faster. And I will say that the offensive line is improving, I think, week by week, but I think Brandon Fusco, he's still a problem. Matt Khalil is not a problem, which is great. Michael Harris is great, but TJ Clemmings, I think he continues to be a problem. But again, more in the running game than in the passing game. Only a couple of hits, only 1 sack, really. But I will say there were a lot more pressures, and this says 2 things. One, I think it says a lot about Teddy getting rid of the ball faster, or on time, I should say, because I think the last 2 games, I think he's had an issue getting rid of the ball on time. But in this game, I thought he got rid of the ball a little bit faster, which helps prevent turning those hurries into hits and those hits into sacks. But also, I think the offensive line is holding for a little bit longer before they give up a hurry, which I think it's like a sign of gradual improvement, The biggest issue was Brandon Fusco against Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald's performance was a little bit weird because, I shouldn't say weird. It was a bit one-dimensional, and I should say this because a lot of 3-technique tackles, get this rep where you get all these sack numbers, you get all these pressure numbers, and you're bad against the run. Aaron Donald was really good against the run and has been really good against the run for his entire 2-year NFL career. So I won't say that that he's a huge run liability for them, but I will say in this game, while he had a lot of plus plays against the run, he had a lot of minus plays against the run because the way he rushed the passer beat the crap out of Brandon Fusco. But sometimes you just open up holes that Adrian Peterson can run right through. Maybe that's the linebacker's fault, maybe that's Aaron Donald's fault. But yeah, I think that the offensive line, I think that they improved in a lot of ways, and that shows up in the run game as well. And I think that they're holding on a little bit better for a little bit longer. But I still think that there's some pretty big liabilities, and I think it's T.J. Clemmings and Brandon Fusco that are the biggest problems. So yeah, I think that the offensive line did better. I think that you could say that Teddy Bridgewater is also responsible. I think for the reduction in hits and sacks.
One thing I wanted to ask about is the multiple overthrows of Mike Wallace. That it seemed weird that the two of them are this out of sync. Mike Wallace ended up with one catch for the entire game, but he just kept overthrowing him. Was this just not being in sync with him, or do you feel like the wide receiver getting jarred at the line just ends up throwing off the timing and just it? I guess my question is, it seems strange that he's overthrowing someone who's that fast.
Well, so I think that there's a couple of things at play. I think the first thing is Teddy was just inaccurate. I think that before you get to anything else, and I think there are other things that contribute to it, I think the primary blame is on Teddy. I think he was just inaccurate. But I will say, one, I think that there was some borderline-ish illegal play. I don't really hate the refs for not calling that. That doesn't really bother me. But, borderline-ish illegal play, which, if it's borderline, is probably good cornerback play. That pulled Wallace a little bit on that, and he was complaining about it. And, I understand, but I think a person with his reputation maybe probably should complain to the refs a little bit less. But he had grounds to complain for sure. And then I think on some of these passes, the receivers are getting a little bit roughed up at the line of scrimmage. Stephon Diggs, actually, throughout the year so far, the one thing that you could probably be worried about is that he didn't have to deal with a lot of press coverage. And then early in the game against Chicago, he did have to deal with press coverage. Wasn't doing a great job against it. And in fact, his biggest plays were against off coverage, that 40-yard touchdown. In this game, he had a little bit of press coverage to deal with, and he did a much better job. But it does throw off the timing a little bit, like you said. And I think that the Vikings, sort of the next step for the passing game is kind of dealing with the way different coverage looks affect the timing of these passes. Mike Wallace is doing a terrible job of adapting to that. Like we mentioned sort of earlier, that he's been rounding off routes, and he's not where he's supposed to be, and that's hurting the offense in a big way. But I think that in this case, for those deep throws, and especially that big overthrow, I think the primary blame is that Teddy is just still not accurate, or won't ever be that accurate on those deep throws. Although I am talking to Ian Wharton, who's at NFL Film Study. He just published a piece, I'll put it in the show notes, that the Vikings are legit Super Bowl contenders. He was doing a lot of rigorous tracking of Teddy, and he thinks that a lot of the worries about the deep ball this year even are just overblown, because his overthrows, they're big misses. But his accurate ones, people are kind of forgetting-ish. You remember sort of Wallace dropping one in the end zone. You remember Rudolph dropping one in the end zone. And a lot of people, it's easier to remember a big miss than it is a close miss. And so I think that that's kind of coloring our interpretation of it a little bit. But I don't think that's enough for me, even someone I trust a lot, who does a very good job of predicting quarterback and wide receiver play based on his work. I don't think that's enough for me to say that Teddy is accurate on the deep ball yet, because unless I do some charting of my own, I'm going to trust my faulty recollection of it than I am that. But it is something that's kind of, hey, maybe that's worth considering.
Let's talk about Stephon Diggs for a moment. There have been concerns about his consistency. He appears to be at least somewhat consistent. He had a pretty decent game. And I guess what I want to ask about is the interception and then his fumble recovery. What are we making of his skills as a wide receiver in this start? Is he improving the way that we'd like him to be?
I think so. One of the things I mentioned is that he was able to find a way to beat press coverage and stay within the timing of the offense, which isn't to say, he magically discovered this thing in one game. He probably knew how to beat press coverage, but just hadn't had to deal with it for so long that it kind of roughed him up in the Chicago game, that he had to get back on his feet to beat it, and he did. So I would count that as improvement, even though that's probably a skill he already had. I think that he's still a good contested catch receiver, but even good contested catch receivers, and I'm not going to call him a great one. I mean, he's not like Alshon Jeffrey, or to use a college example, Josh Doxson, in terms of contested catches. But better than Charles Johnson, right? And so you can't win them all, and so that can kind of lead to maybe interceptions. But he's pretty clearly a pretty aware receiver. He knows where the sticks are. You saw that on the fumble recovery. What an amazing! I mean, it's kind of weird to say amazing fumble recovery, but just what a fantastic job of getting to the ball and recovering it and making sure that it wasn't a turnover. So yeah, I think. I think that he's improving in the ways that we want him to, and I think that there's obviously still stuff to work out with him. You want to see him run every single route. I don't think he's run a ton of 9 routes this year, for example. It'd be kind of cool to see him do that. I don't know if he's run a ton of outs. I know he's run quick outs, but I'd like to see him do that because Teddy's really good at those out and those corner throws, which is weird given sort of the narrative about his arm strength. But yeah, you'd like to see him run maybe a bigger route tree before you can say he's 100% there, but he's definitely improving in the ways that you want him to.
So let's switch to the defense, and let's talk about somebody who's been a star on the defense for a little while now, and is starting to get some real recognition for it. Linval Joseph had himself a phenomenal game. We actually had a question that was sent to us by Nathan S. over email. He says, do you think Linval Joseph's emergence this year is due to his immense physical talents being finally shown after recovering from his gunshot, an adjustment in the Zimmer scheme to protect the young/weakness in the linebacker core, or is this how a nose tackle is supposed to look in Zimmer's system?
I think this is a really, really good question, and there's more coming from the same guy, Nathan Schitzel, who wrote a bunch of really good questions later on when we do the mailbag proper. But I want to say this. I think it's more the second thing he said, adjustment to Zimmer, and less about protecting. The second thing was like a two-part system, like adjustment to Zimmer scheme to protect young weakness. No, I think he's more adjusting to playing for the Zimmer system. So I don't think it's necessarily how a nose tackle is supposed to look, because he's just so talented that you can't say, well, this is what it's supposed to look like. He's playing well above, like, if you had a better version of D'Amato Pecco in Zimmer's system, he wouldn't look like this. I think that he's adapting to what Zimmer wants of him. I think that Zimmer's adapting a little bit to what he has with him. And this year, I think the defensive linemen are allowed to attack a lot more than they were in the last year. And in previous iterations of the Zimmer system, in like Atlanta and Dallas and of course Cincinnati, they talked about it a lot actually. That that they were allowed to attack a lot more this year, and that the linebackers that actually puts more stress on the linebackers, who then have to play a little bit more of a passive role, whereas in previous iterations they did not. And so it allows Joseph to attack a lot more than anchor, but he has to know when he can anchor, and that's kind of the great thing about him, is that he didn't know last year when he could anchor. This year he does. He does know when to anchor. And right now he's the best 4-3 nose tackle in the league. It's not just me saying it. I think we heard the announcers say that, and Charles Davis. We hate announcers a lot on this show and on my Twitter feed, but Charles Davis, he was having a fantastic game announcing. A couple of weird missteps from him here and there. But he mentioned it. I think this is mentioned previously by another announcer this year. Pro Football Focus thinks that this is true. For whatever you think of their work, and Mike Zimmer says it's the best nose tackle he's ever had. So
he's having an All-Pro year, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that if the All-Pro voting system took into account positional responsibilities a little bit better. Like if you had 3-4 outside linebackers and 4-3 outside linebackers, and if you had a nose tackle position, not just 2 defensive tackle positions, I think it'd be a lock that he'd get in as a nose tackle, especially because there's no Dontari Poe this year because he's injured. I think that he's having an All-Pro quality year. I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't make it, but I think he's having an All-Pro quality year.
Yeah, Linval Joseph had himself a hell of a game, but. Moving on to a different position, Greenway looks like he's playing more downs right now. Is this because of his play, or is this simply because we seem to be running out of linebackers quickly?
I think it's more the second than the first. I think because in fact, Mike Zimmer even said to Chad Greenway, "Is it okay if we get you to play longer than was planned?" And he said that before the game, before Kendricks was injured. So. It was kind of an interesting, or before Kendricks was like declared inactive, and so it was kind of an interesting thing to bring up to somebody who previously used to play like every single day. And Chad Greenway played, I believe, all 74 snaps that the Vikings had on defense, and he had a really good game. In fact, what I will say early on, I wasn't confident that he was having a good game, probably both because of A, sort of my natural bias. Sometimes it seems like I look for Chad Greenway to play poorly. But B, he wasn't being targeted on plays that I thought he wasn't performing, doing extraordinarily well. But in this game, I thought he played really well. He was able to get off blocks a lot better. I thought he was able to, I mean, his pass coverage was just the thing that I've, had the biggest issue with him. I thought he played, really phenomenally in this game. But yeah, I think it's you run out of linebackers, you play Chad Greenway more, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's kind of the role I envisioned for him, sans the big contract he has. Is that I think that Chad Greenway is pretty good to have as a backup, not because he's necessarily better than most backups, although this year he is. Last year I'd say he was not, but because it's really good to have an experienced guy, give you sideline coaching, give you coaching in the film room and stuff like that. But in this case, I think his play is a result of a bunch of linebackers missing either by trade or by injury, and a little bit his quality of play because he played pretty well.
Let's bring up Todd Gurley. Gurley definitely showed that he belongs in the NFL. He had a nice little game, but for more or less we kept him in check. You could even say he was good, but clearly not the best running back that was playing that day. How did we stop Todd Gurley?
What's actually interesting, a lot of it was Linval Joseph. I think a lot of it was kind of how terrible the Rams' offensive line was. And a lot of it were, players like Chad Greenway, but Anthony Barr, I thought he had a phenomenal game. Anthony Barr is playing like one of the best linebackers in the NFL right now. It's incredible. But I think, Linval's sort of spearheaded that. I thought Tom Johnson bounced back from, what was probably not a great game. I think that, the defensive ends, I think Robinson maybe had a weak game against the run, but the defensive ends in general, when Daniil Hunter was on the field and Everson Griffin was on the field, I thought they did a pretty good job. Harrison Smith made his presence known pretty loudly on a couple of plays. And then Xavier Rhodes was actually really good against the run, too. So you could say, there was a kind of a collective effort from a lot of players to play well, but I think that the primary benefit I think the primary credit on the fact that Todd Gurley was held in check can be laying at the feet of two people. I think Anthony Barr and Linval Joseph both had great games against the run, and I think that they were the primary reasons, outside of the Rams' terrible offensive linemen, that Todd Gurley was held in check.
Yeah, their offensive linemen really were like some of the best players on our team. Like, it was just so nice that they were really just stepping aside and just letting the man come through and knock him down. It was great. Any more important plays on defense that we should talk about?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I think that Harrison Smith's game, it wasn't. He did miss a tackle. It wasn't great. Kind of like in the Chicago game. The first play that he had was a missed tackle, but after that, I thought he played really sound. It wasn't just sort of announcing himself loudly like I just mentioned, but also like he was really disciplined. He manned in the back of the field really, really well. Nick Foles, obviously not the greatest passer in the NFL by any reasonable stretch of the imagination, but he did attempt 3 passes deep and not much more when the Rams needed much more, 5 passes deep, and they weren't very successful. And I think a lot of that has to do with Harrison Smith. The only instance, I think he probably had a mental error early in the game too in pass coverage, but otherwise I thought that he had the kind of game befitting sort of his status as top 3 or even top. I mean, he's in the debate to be the top safety in the NFL right now, and I think that a game like this helps his cause to that end.
Let's talk about my favorite part of the game, which was overtime. Obviously, Teddy had already been knocked out, and we win the toss and defer and get the win. I'm surprised that when Mike Zimmer walked up to the presser, he didn't clank when he was walking, because he's got something going on there that's nice, that's brass. Like, he just went up and went, no, our defense is going to take this. and we're going to end up with amazing field position after we knock them backwards and backwards. Like, that's a lot of faith in your defense to defer on the kickoff for overtime, right?
Yeah, I think so, but I didn't realize how unusual it was because someone asked me like, "Hey, should the Vikings actually not receive? Should they take the wind?" And I said, "Yeah, I think they should take the wind." And then the Vikings, took the wind, and then a bunch of people were like, "Oh my God, that's so crazy! I can't believe that happened. Oh, it's a bad decision by the coach." And I was kind of surprised because all that happened. The guy I kind of mention this guy every so often on the podcast, at Vikings Lifer, pretty decent follow. You should follow him. He tweeted an interesting thing at me, which I'm going to put in the show notes, which is about all the times in overtime that someone took the wind instead of the kick. The last one I think is supposed to be like Bill Belichick, so obviously there's maybe a little bit of intelligence there. But one thing to note in this specific game, not a single kick was completed, I think, against the wind. I think, because I think when the Rams scored on that side, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I read that wrong. But when the Rams scored, they tried a 2-point conversion instead of a kick, and obviously the 61 and the 52-yard field goals or 50 whatever yard field goal was with the wind. This was a huge advantage, and it's difficult to pass in the wind. I think a lot of people saw that in the second and fourth quarter for them. The first and third, no, sorry, you flip at halftime. So whatever. It was difficult to pass into the wind, No, it was second and fourth quarter for them and first and third quarter for us. It was difficult to pass into the wind. It was difficult to kick into the wind, and it was such a big difference, I think, that it made a lot of sense to take the wind. It makes a lot of sense to trust your defense too, but it takes a lot of balls to say that because a touchdown automatically wins the game. But I think that if you take the wind, you're more likely to force a field goal. It's more likely to miss, and you're going to know if you need to get, a field goal or whatever. I thought it was a ballsy decision while still also being the smart decision for sure.
Yeah, it was a little crazy to see. It was and just a lot of faith in that defense, and later a lot of faith in Blair Walsh to make the kick. It's the second week in a row that Walsh has had the walk-off winner, and I was reading on the Minnesota Vikings Reddit subreddit that there was a thread all about appreciating the gun show that he was blasting after that. And, it turns out that Blair Walsh has some pretty decent sized biceps now. I had no idea. I've never been been that close to Blair Walsh to see it, but they definitely showed it off after the game.
Well, it's easy to forget too because I think he's the shortest player on the team. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole thread on Reddit about Blair's biceps, which is pretty hilarious. And then even better, there's an image about that made the subreddit just now about Blair Walsh versus Gregg Williams, kind of like an old timey promo for those old boxing matches and stuff like that. So yeah, it's pretty great.
Let's just wrap up the discussion on the Rams game real quick. We've won. We are tied for the division lead. For those who have complained that the Vikings have not beaten a team that's over 500, neither have the Packers. The Packers have lost 2 straight. Are tied with us for the lead in the division, and we are turning some serious heads right now with the defense that the Vikings are playing right now. It's crazy to think that if we would have shown up and maybe the game wouldn't have been at 1 a.m. that we could feasibly have ended up with only one loss out of this.
Yeah, no, it's kind of crazy. I mean, the defense has been pretty lights out, and the only place where it isn't lights out is interestingly Football Outsiders, which I don't think has been adjusted for this last week, and that's probably going to help it. But again, that's because Football Outsiders has them going up against the weakest schedule, not because the defense itself is playing poorly.
But if you take a look, I mean, they're second in points per game allowed, which is great. An even better statistic, I think, than that is the fact that they are somewhere around fifth or so in points allowed per drive, which I think is a better measure of scoring defense. I think they're pretty good in terms of defensive efficiency stats. In terms of the ability to pass on the Vikings, they do a pretty good job, and all around, I think this is the kind of defense that you can build a playoff team. And it's been the case before where very good, maybe not great, maybe not like 2013 Seahawks or 2015 Broncos or whatever, but a good defense and an average offense, that's enough to beat, maybe 80% of the teams in the league on a regular-ish basis. So, yeah, no, this defense is fantastic. It's top flight, and it's young, which is like the most amazing thing. And some of the best players on contract, like Linval Joseph, some of the best players who are on contract are both young and on contract for a long time. You just have to worry about maybe Harrison Smith and some Xavier Rhodes deals coming down the road, and I bet they'll be able to fit both of those in relatively easily. So, I'm really excited about the defense now. I'm excited about the future of the defense for sure.
Here's a comparison that I saw on Twitter that initially scared me, and I'm not sure if it is necessarily apt, but I wanted to run this by you. Someone was comparing this Vikings team to the teams that were led by Mark Sanchez and the Jets, that were like successful and ended up going like deep into the playoffs.
2009, 2010 AFC Championship contenders. Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think maybe it's not intentional, but it sounds like it's probably an intentional way to sort of undersell Teddy's play. It's also overselling the Vikings defense. It's a really, really good defense, but it's not, 2009 Jets good. I mean, that was a really good defense. Again, not great 2013 Seahawks, 2015 Broncos, but it was a phenomenally good defense. And I think that the Vikings defense isn't there yet. They still have the propensity to give up big plays here and there. They still have the propensity to give up some underneath stuff here and there. I'd like to see better stuff in the middle of the field, etc. And I think that the offense is better. I think that maybe you could say, the Jets tried to grind it out and then Mark Sanchez was a caretaker, but I don't think that's really what's happening because I think Teddy had a lot more responsibility in the first couple of games of the season and Peterson has more responsibility now, but Teddy is a lot more efficient than I think a lot of people are giving him credit for, and he's doing a lot of the detailed stuff better than Sanchez did. So the comparison certainly exists, but I don't think it's a strong one.
Well, let's go into the mailbag. We have some great questions. We're not going to go terribly in depth on some of these, but we do have a lot of good questions that we want to get to. And we're going to start with James Reed. We got a couple of email questions. First question is, on the 55-yard pass from Nick Foles to Kenny Britt down to our 6 that resulted in a touchdown, who was at fault? Some people on the Daily Norseman's game thread were saying Newman, some were saying Sendejo. Who was responsible for that mess?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because after the game, Mike Zimmer said one of the problems that he has is whenever you see a person running deep downfield by himself, someone screwed up, which implies that I think Newman thought he had help above, and I initially thought this was Newman's fault. I mean, and it's very easy to say, hey, the closest guy to him, that's probably his fault. But we've seen instances where that's not been true before. I think twice Richard Sherman has been blamed for touchdowns that were actually Earl Thomas's fault. And I think in this case, I wouldn't say Newman is blameless because that's his guy, and you work with what you have. I think that had Andrew Sendejo played that correctly, I think that wouldn't have happened. Had Newman played that correctly, it was very unlikely that was going to work. But I think that's more Andrew Sendejo's fault, especially given what we know about the scheme, which includes a safety whose job it is to read the play, read the quarterback's eyes, and get to the deep player before the throw even starts. I think it's more Sendejo's fault than it was Newman's fault. But Newman is definitely not blameless. Good question, though.
Also important to note that both Bridgewater and Newman, just because we're talking about him, have passed the first test for their concussions. So we may not be without both of them on for Sunday's game against Oakland. So it's important to note that he is feeling better. So that was a weird, like, he got hurdled and knocked out at the same time thing. Like, that just seemed weird and wrong on so many levels. Let's go to the next question from James Reed, which was, is our O-line getting better / starting to gel? It looked good against the Bears last week, but I tempered my excitement because the D-line isn't that great. The Rams, on the other hand, were supposed to be really tough even with the injuries. Is the O-line starting to gel a little bit?
Yeah, I answered this question a little bit earlier, sort of in the offense thing, and I think that the O-line is looking better, and I think it's gelling a little bit better in terms of, like, communication. Like, one of the issues that was a problem with, say, Clemmings earlier in the year is that he wasn't picking up his assignments, and so he'd block down when he was supposed to kick out. He'd miss, blitzers and stuff like that. That was his responsibility, and he's doing a lot less of that now. And so that's great. That's a huge thing. And some of it, I think, is that the O-line is just playing better. I think, Matt Khalil, I think he's only had one bad game, and it was against Denver, which, maybe you can forgive him for that. And Mike Harris has been playing. I actually just voted for him in the Pro Bowl. I think he's playing, probably, if I'm being completely honest, he's playing at just below Pro Bowl level. And they let you vote for, like, 6 guards, so it's not like a huge compliment to saying he's just below Pro Bowl level if you can get 6 in, but it's still a big compliment, I think. And I think that's a big thing. I think Berger's playing a little bit better than he did earlier in the year. You still have to watch out for Clemmings on occasion, for sure, and you have to watch out for Fusco, who I don't know what the issue is. Maybe he's secretly injured. We find out about a lot of these after season's over. Maybe he just doesn't know how to adapt playing on the left side, which is kind of unusual. But the O-line's better. It's gelling a little bit better. It's still a problem. 42% of Teddy's dropbacks were pressured, so Teddy is also doing a better job at dealing with pressure. I think that's something that people are forgetting is a skill a quarterback has.
Yeah. Nathan, who we talked about earlier, has a second question, which was, there was a play package that had a handoff to Gurley, or a jet to Austin, or a deep toss to Britt that had some success. Are package plays like that historically successful against Zimmer, or was it just the one-on-one matchup that was doing it?
It's a really good question, too. And when you take a look at Zimmer's Cincinnati defenses, at times when he's able to play against, packaged offenses, and there's not a lot of them because package plays are really, really new to the NFL. One can say that, the preponderance of them really began in 2012, and a lot of them came from Washington, a lot of them came from Seattle with Russell Wilson and Robert Griffin, but they don't rely on mobile quarterbacks necessarily. I think, as we saw in this Rams game, and then we saw Chip Kelly do them, but there hasn't been a lot of that, and there hasn't been a ton of Zimmer against offenses that tend to employ package plays pretty often. But I think in this case they weren't necessarily package plays because Foles' eyes were not at the defense when he was when a lot of these decisions would be made. I think that they were designed plays first. But for the defense, that doesn't really matter because they still need to know what's coming. And I think that given what we know of Mike Zimmer defenses against this kind of, I wouldn't say triple option, but more complex trickeration, I guess, is that he traditionally is actually not that weak to it. Again, a little bit sample of data. It's traditionally not weak to it. And then the Vikings, players should have played a little bit more disciplined because I think the scheme itself and Zimmer, the way that he coaches, are not necessarily prone to this sort of thing. And to their credit, I think after halftime it was really difficult to get those plays going again. But yeah, I think that that's not a consistent thing you have to be worried about.
Next question is also from Nathan Schatzel, who says, do you have Peterson's run success as compared to other games? I missed a word in there. Okay, 55-26. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Do you have Peterson's run success rate as compared to other games, as it seemed he had a lot more successful runs in this game?
Yeah, actually. So I saw this question pretty early before the show started, and I thought it was interesting enough to do a little bit of statistical analysis on it. So there's 4 basic statistics that I'm using to track running backs this year, and in particular, of course, Adrian Peterson. And I was going to write a piece, but as you all know, I've been really bad about writing pieces this year.
But I will say the four statistics are, of course, the yards per carry, which is like just a generic efficiency stat. It's not super great for two reasons. First, it doesn't take situational play into account. And second, it's really prone to positive skewing, which is to say a 50-yard run can skew yards per carry in ways that don't reflect the running back's true talent, especially because a 50-yard run and a 40-yard run and an 80-yard run are all more dependent on field position than they are the running back's talent, almost always, and they skew different amounts. So there's that. Then there's what's an interquartile mean, which gets rid of the top 25% and bottom 25% of runs, then averages those. And the average you want there is about 3.2. And then a success rate by down and distance and success rate by expected play. So his yards per carry was 4.28 before the last two games, 4.49 after the last two games. His interquartile mean just did not change that much, 2.73 versus 2.76. His success rate didn't change that much from a down and distance perspective, 42.6. That's pretty bad. And it is now 43.2%. That's still kind of bad. But his expected point success rate, which measures whether or not you've added the expected points based on down and distance and position on the field or subtracted from expected points, it was 33.7%. That's league low. That's really bad. But now it's at 63.3%. Some of that has to do, and so that one's context sensitive too. If you run and don't fumble the ball away, if you don't lose a fumble when you run the ball, in situations where you have more than a one-score lead, your expected point success rate, jumps up a lot. But that has risen from 33.7% to 63.3%, so a huge dramatic jump. I think by most measures, his average over the course of the season has not changed all that much. By one measure, it has. But I will say, based off of what it looks like how he's playing, I think that he has turned a leaf. And I think that these two games, if you just measured those statistics alone in those two games, they would look a lot better.
Next question is from Josh Bjork on Twitter, who asks, is Mike Wallace broken? Is he quietly getting open like Jennings was?
I think this is a good question. And it was interesting because I think after the first couple of games that Mike Wallace was playing, he'd gained a lot of receptions. He was moving the chains. And a couple of people were snarking at me like, hey, do you think the Mike Wallace move is good now? And I had to admit that, yeah, he's doing a much better job than Greg Jennings was in Minnesota. Jennings, of course, is not doing a very good job in Miami because he's behind some pretty talented receivers, but also behind Rashard Matthews. And so I think that question is moot because I think, hey, Greg Jennings isn't doing well, so it's kind of difficult to say that he would continue to do well. But I will say that early in the season, and this is an observation I shared on Twitter, Mike Wallace was doing pretty well early in the season, and that has a lot to do with, A, focus in terms of like catching the ball versus dropping the ball, and also detail. So that's kind of another way to say focus, but this time in terms of route running, I thought his route running was sharper. I thought that he was running his routes at the appropriate depth early in the season. The past three games, I don't think he was. I think his route running has dropped off. He's rounding off routes, not just on sort of the one throw that a lot of people remember on third down that looked like Teddy was inaccurate, but Wallace was just off. But also just in general, it's just more difficult for him to get open, and I think that's his fault and not the level of competition he's up against. So maybe he's broken, but whatever it is, he's lost a lot of focus since the season started, and that's being reflected in his statistics.
Next question is from Racer K, who asks, how much improvement have we seen from Clemmings over the first 8 games?
Yeah, I talked about this a little bit. He's still an issue, I think, against speed rushers, but in terms of communication, we're seeing vast amounts of improvement. I'd like to see, better technique coming out of a stance. His feet are still pointed straight, but stuff like that. When he gets out of a stance and how he kicks life, stuff like that. Mostly, he's still vulnerable to speed rushers. There are times when his stance makes him a little bit vulnerable to bull rushers, but he's doing better. As a run blocker, he's still pretty poor. His communication is better, but as a run blocker, he's still pretty poor, and he's missing his second-level assignments a lot. His technique in run blocking is a bigger issue than his technique in pass protection right now, but he is improving a lot.
Next question is from Tommy Gunn, who asks, was Teddy in an upswing before he was being laid out, or do you feel the score would have been about the same with him in?
No, I thought that he was playing a little bit better after the first couple of drives again, but I wouldn't say that enough to say that the score would have been significantly different. Probably enough to avoid overtime, I guess. But Sean Hill was playing really badly, so I don't think that's enormous praise on Teddy. Yeah, I wouldn't say he was on an upswing enough to be like huge or significant, but I think that the Vikings would have been able to prevent overtime.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Moving on to Jesse Silva, who is apparently a professional account now.
Yeah, it's a professional account.
Yeah. Quiz question is, why is nobody talking about how well Linval Joseph is playing, and does he deserve to be an All-Pro? We sort of focused on this earlier, but why aren't the people paying attention to Linval Joseph, damn it?
Well, I think the past couple of weeks, the national media has paid a lot more attention, and I think that the commentators, and normally, like I said, we kind of reserve a lot of criticism for commentators. The commentators for the past couple of weeks have also been very, very impressed by Linval Joseph, and they put him out there. I don't think he will be an All-Pro, like I said, but like, he deserves to be. But I think the biggest reason a player like Linval Joseph doesn't get that much attention, unless you play for like years, like Pat Williams did, is that he's a nose tackle. It's very difficult to get attention as a nose tackle. I mean, Dontari Poe was maybe the best defensive tackle in the league last year, and not many people paid attention to him.
Considering the nose tackle we had before Linval Joseph, maybe Minnesota people are just getting used to the idea of having a decent nose tackle.
Yeah, I think Minnesota people are finally happy that they've got a great one, but Pat Williams kind of does deaden our ability to evaluate nose tackles a little bit. There's a kind of a gap after Pat Williams left for about a couple of years. But yeah, it kind of deadens our ability to really appreciate a nose tackle. But I think in terms of national recognition, I think part of it is just, you play the nose tackle position. You don't tend to rack up numbers. Yeah.
I believe our nose tackle before Linval Joseph now plays for the Packers, and while he's playing better, he does have a tendency of getting pulled over with guns and money and drugs in his car. So I did see a recent article where they had described him as a former Viking, and I went, no. No.
This is your problem now.
This is a current Packer player. I'm sorry. He was not arrested as a Viking. No. Everybody else was, but not him. Nope, he waited until he became a Packer to spread that stink. Good for him. Justin Rubin on Twitter asks, with the O-line improving, do you think that Norv will start letting our tight ends get to work in the passing game again?
Nope. I don't think it's improved enough for that yet.
No, we're not quite at that level. In fact, that may be the glue that's very, very flimsily keeping this line together. But no, I don't think the tight ends are ready for that. Last question from Diggin' Diggs on Twitter. He says, I was skeptical about the Gerald Hodges trade in case of injuries. How confident can we be in the depth now that there's some injuries?
I would like to say I told you so because we were critics of the Hodges trade, but I can't do so in all honesty because my criticism was more directed at the amount of value the Vikings got out of it, and not about the depth, which I was impressed with when they made the trade, which is probably a driving reason for the trade. So I can't quite say I told you so. I do think the depth is good. I think that Audie Cole, who did not have an amazing game or anything like that, in fact, he got blown up against the fullback and he got blown up against a couple of bad guards, in this game against the run, which is kind of unusual. The last time he played Chicago, he was lights out. It was one of the best linebacker games I've seen in the past couple of years. But I still think the depth is good. I think that when your depth, in nickel, when your depth is like Greenway and Cole and Edmund Robinson and Brandon Watts, I think that's really good. I think in 4-3 base, your depth is a little bit weaker, obviously. Because then you've got Greenway outside, Kendricks inside, and then you've got Audie Cole as your backup as opposed to Greenway as your backup. And then you've got more positions to replace. I think that can be kind of weak or whatever. But, depending on what the Vikings think of Brandon Watson, they think kind of highly of him, and what the Vikings think of Edmund Robinson, who is extremely raw. I think the depth is all right. It's all right. It's not the best in the league anymore, but it's all right.
We will survive some of these weird injuries. And Audie Cole going out is certainly not the best sort of scenario we envision. That's an ugly little injury of his.
Yeah, I guess. What, it was a fractured ankle. He's out for the year.
Yep.
Yeah, I missed that when I was going over the depth. Yeah, no, it's a problem. You're right. Sorry. That's my bad.
Yeah, I caught something Arif didn't. Damn it.
Whoops.
I'll hear about this after the show. All right. Well, that is going to be it for the game and for the show. Arif, do you have anything to plug? Any recent articles? Anything you wish to force upon the listening audience?
Nope, but it looks like, based off of what I've written down so far, the show notes are going to be nice and extensive. So there's going to be a couple of good articles in there. One from Pro Football Focus about the Vikings that we didn't talk about on the show that I think is really good. And a couple of other things to take a look at. So instead of reading my stuff, which you've gotten used to not being able to read because I haven't written it, although I do plan on writing another one. We'll see if that works out. You get to read a bunch of other really, really cool stuff about how awesome the Vikings are and how you should love them.
Yeah, so look out for that. The ways you can listen to this show are pretty obvious. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. You want to do that, so that way, as soon as the episode comes out, you'll have right away access to it. You want that, don't you? Yes, you do. Go ahead and subscribe to us on iTunes. We are on Stitcher. We also have this posted on the Daily Norseman page, which is also going to contain our show notes. You can also go to NorseCodePodcast.com. That is where we will have additional show notes and the donate button to donate to the show, to provide us with a little bit of money to keep the lights on. If you like the show, you can certainly donate to us by clicking the donate link. You can also go to our Patreon page and become a sustaining member and continually help us out. Again, we do appreciate any and all love that you are willing to give us. My goal is to get us to 100,000 listens total at this particular server, and I think we can do it by the end of December. So recommend the podcast to a friend. Post it on Facebook. Post it on Twitter. Give it to your parents. Your parents like technology, right? They're probably great at it. Show them the podcast app. Show them Norse Code. That is going to be it for us. My Twitter handle, I do the Norse Code podcast Twitter. I am at NorseCodeDN. Personal account at Big Mono. You can follow Arif at ArifHassanNFL. And you can follow Dusty, who will be hosting the next episode later in the week, at Dusty O'Connell. You can also email us questions or tips or concerns at NorseCodePodcast@gmail.com. Do we leave anything out? Are we good?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Well, on behalf of Arif, I am James. Thanks again for listening, and our formula is this: keep Teddy alive. We'll see you later this week.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.